Tips from Trestle is brought to you by eMenu Choice Point of Sale and Clark Food Service Equipment. Welcome to Tips from Trestle, the Senior Living Food and Hospitality Podcast. This podcast explores the senior living industry with a unique focus on food, hospitality, and the community experience. I'm your host, Aaron Fish. My goal for this podcast: educate, inform, and inspire leaders in senior living. How? By bringing the resident and customer experience to the front of mind in our industry. We should bring the passionate spirit of food and hospitality to everything that we do and everyone we serve each and every day. So what are we waiting for? Let's get to it. Today on Tips from Trestle, I'm joined again by Katie Griffith. Katie is CEO and founder of Bytes Solutions, a technology consulting firm exclusively serving senior living communities. Katie began Bytes Solutions 9 years ago when she saw a need for providers to have an unbiased third party help them navigate the technology solutions available to them and optimize their use of technology. Katie also serves on the Leading Age Pennsylvania Board of Directors and believes that technology is not a strategy and enables providers to get the results they expect from their technology investments. Katie, thanks for joining me today on Tips from Trestle.
Thanks for having me, Aaron.
So I always love getting together because we're always talking tech, and I think our industry has finally began to embrace technology. It's funny that it took the pandemic for us to realize that, hey, there's all this great technology out there that can help us make running our communities better. And so it's kind of a great time to be digging into this. And so we were talking about menus and talking about tech friendly menus. So I wanted to spend our podcast today kind of diving into that. And so when you hear me say the phrase tech friendly menu, kind of what does that mean to you? And what are you thinking about on the technology side when it comes to those tech friendly menus?
Yeah, well, I'm excited about our conversation because the start of my career was food service technology. So it's my favorite kind. Uh, and yeah, I run into this so many times just around, you have your different technologies that you're using throughout your culinary operations. And you start to realize like building your menus, you do have to think about the technology and they all play kind of a different role. So you have your menu management or recipe management or inventory tracking and ordering systems in the back of the house. And then you have your point of sale system, of course, out in the front of the house for ringing up transactions. And now we have, all these other solutions like we've had digital signs for a long time, but of course you want your menus up there. And then you have the mobile apps where the residents can go online or staff members and
Mhm.
go on their mobile phone and see the menu for the day and even place orders. We have self-service kiosks. So I love these beautiful marketplaces that I've seen built in communities. And you can walk up and order something from an individual, but they'll also sometimes have those self-service kiosks to place your order yourself. So, we've got all these different platforms and different purposes. And, we need to be thoughtful about how we build our menus when we're, displaying our menus and using them on in these different platforms.
Yeah, it's funny because just a few years back, the idea of having a point of sale in a senior living community, say like assisted living or even a memory care, like it seems such a foreign idea and a foreign concept because it's just memory care. Like we don't need to have all of this fancy tech to be able to do this. But with being able to have operators understand, well, there's a lot of information that you can gather, you can learn about residents, you can really better manage everything. It's really become more of this. And all of these different technologies, one of the things that I have seen as I work with clients and operations is that they're not necessarily designed to communicate with each other very well, and they all require kind of some different things when you think about menus. And so, when you think about that, what do you see as the biggest struggles that operators are dealing with right now when it comes to using all of these different platforms and trying to get them integrated into their food service operation?
Yeah, absolutely. We get complaints, it's like I'm having to re-enter these menus in all these different places and it is really inconvenient at times.
Yeah.
There are some opportunities for integration, but you have to balance the cost of that, the effort it's going to take, and the maintenance that's going to be required. So, people kind of just say, hey, well, why don't we just integrate everything so I can enter it into one place, enter that menu and it's just going to show up everywhere. And, again, there's some opportunity for automation there, but a lot of times you end up realizing that just taking that extra time to enter it in a couple places sometimes ends up being easier and the most cost effective way. But
Yeah.
there are platforms, where they will have the different areas where you can write different descriptions. So, when you think about, ordering to a vendor items or your recipe management, so your staff going to produce this food, the description and things for those recipes might be a little different for them than what you need on the point of sale. The point of sale is two things as far as how you write your menus for that.
Mhm.
One is what's it going to look like to the kitchen of, hey, someone ordered a cheeseburger, right? Like, what does it need to say on there? What are the
Yeah.
modifiers? Also, the other piece of it is, of course, the transaction itself. So charging the resident appropriately, or maybe it's included, or the staff member charge or guest charge. So, that menu obviously has to be written to accommodate those two things. I mean, that's
Yeah.
an deal in the point of sale. So sometimes it's hard to translate from the back of the house menus that you have developed just straight into the point of sale, but there is opportunity to do that. Unfortunately, I feel like we don't have a lot of systems that allow you to just say,
Yeah.
"Hey, here's my recipe. Oh, by the way, it's also I want this recipe to also show up on the point of sale, and here's what I want the button to say, and here's what I want it to say when it's printed in the kitchen." Like we're missing some functionality there a lot of
Yeah.
times.
I totally agree with what you're saying. And as you were talking, I'm sitting here just thinking like, well, that's the biggest issue is that we have all of these great platforms, but what they need, and as far as like how they need to communicate out information can be very, very different, right? Like the descriptor for a digital sign that you want for an item is going to look very different than the modifiers that get printed on the kitchen chit that comes out of your point of sale printer, right? The kitchen doesn't need the flowery language, the robust descriptors. They want to know it's a cheeseburger with lettuce, tomato, pickles, fries, and that's it, right? Whereas on the front, you're gonna have all of these different things where you're just being much more descriptive about, maybe it's an Angus patty and it's a sesame seed bun or it's a pretzel bun or whatever. In the kitchen, they know that ingredient. Whereas on the front, those guests and residents need to see that. And so w- one of the things you had mentioned was kind of this, I guess it's the newest of all these technologies, which is the mobile ordering. I think that's kind of something we've found more necessary because of kind of the lockdowns and quarantines that we've had to experience and finding value in that technology. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are on how operators are using it, some of the struggles you've seen with operators integrating it into their operations and trying to just sort out like what's the best way to make these user friendly.
So we talked about creating these menus or entering them into these systems and maybe having different descriptions and what needs to show up on the point of sale and what needs to show up in the recipe management system. But then we've got online ordering or even self-service kiosks. So what do you want it to look like there? And then of course we mentioned the digital signs. So you can see how these are all going to be different flavors of the
Yeah.
same menu, right? No pun intended. Uh, so when I go to order something online, at a restaurant, it's it varies how frustrating the experience is, honestly, and sometimes
Right.
I'm like, just call someone and say what I want because it takes forever for me to hunt through all these modifiers and everything. So, yeah, we're seeing online ordering being popular with the residents as much as we want them to come back to the dining room. You
Yeah.
know, kind of spoiled them a little bit over the pandemic. So there's a little more of that than we normally wanted to pre-pandemic wanted to tolerate. But also with staff, our staff are so busy, clinical staff, administration, across the board, everyone, serving our residents, they have very limited time. So online ordering is awesome for our staff members to be able to just, place their order for lunch and then they'll just go grab it, when the time comes. But being able to just do that right from their desk or while they're walking down the hall, just
Yes.
during their order. So but with either scenario, whether it's a resident or a staff member, we just need to think about yes, we want them to have a million options and choice of how they want their food. However, you have to balance that with the complexity of scrolling through 5 pages of modifiers. I mean,
Yeah. No, you're so on point with that because I think about, especially when you talk about employees and employee meals, that is such an, for the operators, the owner operators listening, employee meal revenue is a really deep, untapped pool of revenue for them. I've done the quick math on this. If you've got 40 employees in your community, and if they all spent 10% of their disposable income, you're looking at a couple $100 a month from every employee. Now all of a
wow.
sudden you just found 8 to $10,000, right? So, but to your point, if it's confusing, if it's hard to use, if it's clunky, like why bother, right? I'm better off using the Jimmy John's app or ordering from Chipotle or whatever it might be because I know their system. It's a little bit more user friendly. And so what you're saying about it needing to be very mindful and thought out. The other piece is I think a lot of times we get into this mindset of we want to give residents and employees, we want to give them all the options. And sometimes that's just not conducive to a successful operation. Like maybe it's better to do 5 things well, as opposed to offering 15 or 20 modifiers that, you know, the bell curve tells you that maybe half of those aren't going to get used, but once or twice a month anyway. So I think you make a really good point about the flexibility and the ease of use that needs to be put in place with mobile ordering.
Yeah, and maybe you don't even offer all your whole menu on mobile ordering or on, a self-service kiosk, and it's you know, it it's just something that you need to think about and sit down and plan, right? And plan it out and kinda say, what makes sense? What's the right balance here for these menus? And then once you feel like you've established the right balance, let's roll it out with some champions initially
Yeah.
and get feedback from them on, and even beyond the first initial launch with those champions and then with the rest of your community, continue to have that communication flow of feedback and considering, what they're saying and maybe making some tweaks along the way.
Yeah, I think that's really important, right? Because you're gonna have, I mean, it's really 2 different audiences, right? When you think about we're gonna have residents looking at this and you're gonna have employees looking at it, 2 very different audiences, and you kinda maybe need to think about how you can talk to both of them, and so definitely something to think about when you're talking about those tech champions, which I know is something that you're really big on with when you do integrations. One thing I wanted to ask you about that I think is sometimes not really thought about when we think about integrating tech or bringing new tech in is kind of balancing out like the cost of it versus the effort that's going to have to be put into not just implement it, but also to maintain it. And so when you think about that, what are some of the either the struggles or successes that you've seen that kind of helps make that all make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yes, again, ideally, it's like, can I just enter my menu in one place and then it's going to just appear in all the places and in all the things the way that I need it to, right? That would be great. And it's, of course, it's technologically possible, right?
Yeah.
But I think about, like you think about ERP systems like the SAPs of the world, and
Mhm.
I think back to like, GE, like how much money they spend working on their ERP every year. I mean, that's obviously a much larger scale. I mean, tens of millions of dollars goes into them just trying to use an ERP, which is essentially a similar thing where you enter something once and then everything just happens. It's supposed to happen with it, right?
Right.
So kind of my geeky side coming out, but yes, it's possible, but the amount of time and money that would be required, and you don't want to have a bunch of custom things built just to solve this problem, right? So what you really have to do and what we do all the time is really just look at this individual community or our organization, right?
Mhm.
And decide what is the give and take. So, depending on the community and what, the makeup of the community, the residents, what they're trying to do, is online ordering and kiosks, like, and digital signage the biggest priority here, or is it something else? We can look at the technology landscape at that organization and really just kind of design the right solution, from A to Z. So there's some based on what's really important to this organization, we can say, well, great. We think this vendor, has a really good solution where it's going to get us part of the way. It's going to be an easier maintenance of these menus by using the right combination of technologies based on what your requirements are. Some of them are just integrated right in from back office to point of sale, which is great. So you can build that out, but maybe you'll need to do a little extra work on the digital sign, side of things. But we can set it up in a way where that that process is streamlined and efficient and as easy as it can be for you.
Yeah, when you're talking through that, I start thinking about, well, it would be great if you could enter the menu one time and it does everything, but there's so many different components for so many different systems that depending on the size of your operation, maybe it makes sense to have, you know, 2 points of data entry or and have the proper workflows, right? So it's really about, I think, when you write and create that initial menu, that you think about all the different pieces of tech and how you're gonna have to share the menu and communicate the menu, because, for example, you may have like a grilled shrimp salad, right? So there, maybe it comes with like a cilantro lime dressing and you've got all these different toppings on it. Well, you need to have the main descriptor that describes all of it in this flowery language. You need to have the modifiers to be able to say to take these things off or to change the dressing. But then you need to have, like the mobile ordering where it's simply, much more simplified. And so you've got all of those pieces of the puzzle. And so it almost comes back to when you're building the menu, I think up front, to be more mindful about I need all of these pieces of the puzzle as I create my cycle menus, as I create my menus for whatever period of time. Because otherwise, I'm going to have to be creating them on the fly, and that might interrupt the actual workflow. Because it may be the front desk, it may be the activities director, who knows who's doing the digital signage component for them. And I think that's a piece that sometimes we might miss when we're building out menus is we think we got this great menu, we've got all the ingredients, but we miss sometimes the rest of it because we're not thinking about all the different places that it could live.
That's right. And, not to mention maybe your initiative is to, have some of the nutritional information on the menu, right? For
Yeah.
the to see. And then, of course we have the dietitian type functions and things like that too that we didn't really get to yet. But you can create a plan And also, getting the right combination of vendors, right? The technology platforms, which ones are going to accommodate what we're trying to do? What's the most important to us? And like you
Mhm.
said, you can kind of have just maybe 2 points of entry, like you mentioned, and have the right process and workflow that's really going to lessen the burden and that administrative burden. But some of these technology platforms, can accommodate a large chunk of what we're talking about. But there are some gaps. So identifying what gaps are we okay with and which ones are we not okay with, and then finding the right vendors to help us. And then with those vendors, are they willing to maybe write some things for us? So, hey, we kind of figured out the right mix of technology for our community.
Yeah.
Um, but hey, you too, if you could write this integration, or if you could have this flow over, or make these changes to your features and functions, I'm always an advocate for any vendor technology platform that you partner with. They should be open to working well with others,
Mhm. Yes.
other tech platforms, and listening to your needs and being willing to, make some adjustments to their tech.
Yeah, no, I think the what you're talking about with, like, APIs and figuring out ways to have systems kind of talk to each other, the key point that you said there that always stuck out in my mind was the willingness of that vendor to participate in the process. I remember very clearly working with a unnamed rooms management accounting software that is very adamant about they didn't want to connect to different softwares. Like their API had to be done a certain way. They had a really high like cost threshold to do API, and it really was a struggle for our point of sale system. All we wanted to do was we wanted to be able to pull out resident charges directly to accounting. So there wasn't a manual process. There was still always a review, but we didn't want it to have to be like, let's review it. Now we've got to enter it, right? We wanted to be able to review the report. Oh, that looks correct. Let's send it. And I think it's really key that technology vendors in the senior living space realize that we have to talk to multiple things. I mean, we talked about simple menu tech talking to each other, but you've got medical records, you've got accounting, you've got, your website. Like there's all of these other opportunities and places where they have to communicate. And so I think that's definitely a key. And I'm glad you brought it up. So, um,
Just saying, "Hey, do you integrate?" and asking that question of vendors isn't enough. And I have had situations where it's like, "Katie, I need you to come in here and talk to this vendor because they promised that they could integrate with all these things and they're not doing it." Well, come to find out, yes, it was all technically possible, but there's a tremendous amount of work on the client side to make this come to fruition. So you have to know what data
mm,
do I wanna go where,
yeah,
and and then actually make sure your data is right so it can go there and make everything accurate. So it is very much a partnership and a process that all of us go through, the business side, the tech folks, and the vendor, the technology platform. So
yeah. As we wrap up, I've started asking people, what's the biggest takeaway, right? Because I want our listeners to kind of be like, well, there's a lot of information here, but if I had one key idea to take away, what would that be in everything we've talked about that you think would be the most important for making menus more tech friendly?
sure. Just take the time, and it doesn't have to be a lot of time, but just sit down and, think through the different outcomes that you're looking for in these different platforms. And what does that mean for your menu? So being able to kind of be thoughtful about the different ways that the menu is going to be used in these different platforms. And it really just is a matter of sitting down and talking through it internally and with your technology provider, instead of just, oh, they don't integrate. I wish they did. Or, oh, I wish
Yeah.
this could happen. Really, it's just a matter of being willing to sit down and thoughtfully create your strategy around it and working hand in hand with your technology provider to optimize, the way that this is going to work for your community.
Yeah, no, that's I think a great thought, and I think it kind of sums up this whole entire conversation really well. So, Katie, it's always a pleasure to pick your brain and learn about how tech is going to impact us in the senior living space. So, thanks for taking time today here on Tips from Trestle.
Thanks, Aaron, for having me again. It's always such a pleasure and so much fun.
So there it is, everybody. Another one in the books. Thanks again for tuning in. Please follow, like, and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to follow us on social media at Tips from Trestle. You can also learn more about the work I do by following me on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and even TikTok. And be sure to check out Trestle Hospitality Concepts at www.trestlehospitalityconcepts.com. I'm your host, Aaron Fish, and this has been another episode of Tips from Trestle.